Colorado adopts sweeping new restrictions on semi-automatic firearms. Plus, the ATF announces new policy and leadership changes. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. The reload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end of the show. To kick things off this week, the big news is out of my own home state of Colorado. And that's because yesterday, Thursday of this week, as of our recording, Governor Jared Polis officially signed Senate Bill 3 into law. This is, of course, the massive semi-automatic, was originally a flat-out semi-automatic ban that became more of a ban with a carve-out for folks that go through an entirely novel permit-to-purchase type scheme. So probably the most sweeping gun restrictions ever to be considered in the state of Colorado have become law.
Yeah, big development. Obviously, we kind of been following this, and especially once they made that change from a sales ban to this permit-to-purchase scheme, especially with the involvement of Polis throughout that change, it seemed pretty likely this was going to become law, and now it has.
Yep.
And it is. You just walk us through exactly how, what does this apply to, and how do you get the permit to purchase?
Sure. Yeah. It's a little bit convoluted, so people bear with me, but it applies to what they call specified semi-automatic firearms. And those include all semi-automatic rifles, semi-automatic shotguns, gas-operated semi-automatic handguns that accept detachable magazines.
But and not really gas-operated, right?
I was going to say, what they mean by gas-operated is they're trying to go after things like AR pistols and the like that. Even though the definition would seem to include a lot of other modern handguns, they keep giving assurances that, no, we're not trying to go after your modern striker-fired semi-automatic handguns and such. So a little bit convoluted, like I said. And then the permit-to-purchase process is even more complicated. It would involve a person having to go to their local sheriff, sort of like a concealed carry permit situation, where they would have to pass a background check and submit fingerprints and pay a fee. But instead of getting a permit from their sheriff would give them what's called a training eligibility card. And so it makes them eligible to take a newly created firearm safety class that would be administered by the state's Parks and Wildlife. So basically your wildlife services that currently doesn't do anything with gun sales, but is going to be empowered to facilitate this. And you have two training options at that point. So if you have your hunter safety card currently, you're eligible to only take a 4-hour class through Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And if you don't, you have to take a 12-hour class that must be at minimum split between 2 days. So they're trying to make it as onerous as possible here, obviously. And it would include things like live fire. And there's a whole bunch of things that are specified in law about what the curriculum must include. And then you have to pass a written test at the end that you have to score at least 90% on. And then once you've done all of that, you're eligible for 5 years to purchase basically the same sorts of firearms that folks can purchase now, as long as they can pass a background check.
And you'd have to go through that process again in 5 years if you wanted to keep buying these kinds of things, right?
That's right. Yeah. Every 5 years, if you want to keep buying those guns, you have to do the whole thing over again. And they don't, obviously all of this, people are probably thinking, well, that sounds expensive and that sounds like it might take a little while. And they're probably right. And I think one of the big hangups in this bill is that there's no cap to what these agencies can charge, and there's no time limit. So, a lot of states have, like for concealed carry permits, for instance, they say this agency within 90 days shall issue you a permit, provided you meet all the requirements. And a lot of state statutes, including Colorado for carry permits, for instance, will specify in state law, this is the fee that you may charge to, recover your costs. This bill doesn't do that. So I think a lot of people are a little bit nervous about what the eventual costs and time is going to be for this whole process.
Yeah, I bet. And obviously this is very likely to be challenged in court. What's the news on that front?
Yeah, so I reached out to the Colorado, State Shooting Association. I always get them confused, the CSSA. A lot of these gun groups have similar acronyms, but they're the state NRA affiliate here in Colorado, and they have already come out and said they're reviewing their options. They plan to file a lawsuit. Rocky Mountain Gun Owners is another gun rights group that's out here. They've started talking about putting together some sort of a legal challenge. I'm willing to bet, this law got a lot of national attention. So I think I wouldn't be surprised to see a bunch of the national gun groups try to get involved as well. So I think it's just a matter of time. They'll probably, my guess is, wait for it to go into effect. They part of the amendment process that you referred to earlier is that they extended the effective date of this law until August of next year. So there's kind of a long time before this takes effect. So we may see maybe a delay in lawsuits being filed. I don't know that for a fact, but it will eventually happen. You can guarantee it.
Yeah. Although in the meantime, I assume you'll see quite a lot of gun sales during that delay period. These affected firearms, because it does, as you mentioned, seems very sweeping. In fact, there's even a provision on that goes after, it seems intended to go after things like bump stocks or binary triggers, but under the law, it really goes after anything that can materially increase the rate of fire of a semi-automatic, right? Which, that could apply to a lot, like lighter triggers in theory.
Yeah, this one really didn't get, I think, as much attention as I expected it would. And maybe it's just because of the line of work that we're in, and we cover these stories across the country when this happens. But here in Colorado, it really flew under the radar. Like you said, it was meant to, they've tried for the last couple of sessions to attach bump stock bans and the like to assault weapon bans. And the way this law does it is it goes after rapid fire devices. And that's, like you said, it's defined liberally to include basically any part or combination of parts that increases the rate of fire at all of a semi-automatic firearm above what that semi-automatic firearm would be. It's like stock. Yeah. And this came up a little bit during committee because I think someone raised that sounds like it would apply to basic trigger modifications. And, the bill sponsors were like, oh no, that's ridiculous. It's just going after machine gun devices. But I mean, if the statute says what the statute says, that does seem like it could trip up just about anybody making a 1 pound difference in their trigger, because technically that could increase the rate of fire.
Increases your rate of fire. Yeah. I mean, by the letter of the law, that seems problematic. But this is an interesting approach because it is a deviation from what you've seen from most blue states, right? Because and from even Colorado itself, which has tried to pass assault weapons bans, a ban on sale of most of these target guns. Although this law honestly goes beyond your typical assault weapons ban as far as what it encompasses. Right. But this is not a sales ban; it's a permit to purchase scheme. And the sales bans couldn't pass in Colorado, but this could. And honestly, looking at Bruin, this is has a better chance of standing up in court than a outright sales ban does, because this, in theory, this is a shall issue permitting system, right? There's none of the subjectivity that the court disliked so much in Bruin, and it's not a ban on possession or sale. It's a very onerous permitting scheme. Now, I guess the question there, to me at least, is whether this permitting scheme is too onerous. And you can see them taking from other states that have mainly done this for, the carry permitting. But, a lot of the Bruin response laws have pretty similar requirements for training. It's a little different. There's some caveats. There's a whole hunter safety thing being a sort of shortcut to getting an easier safety course being one. And also it sounds like they're probably most vulnerable on the amount of training they're trying to require, and then how much they're going to be charging people to go through this process and how long it's going to take. That's been pain points for some of these other permitting schemes. But, in Bruin, Kavanaugh did a whole concurrence, and there was a footnote that talks about how they're not questioning shall issue permitting schemes for carry, and they're putting carry on the same plane as ownership. So you really have to wonder where the Supreme Court would come down on something like this law. And also I would this is where I'd expect things to perhaps move over the next couple of years in states that are looking at these kinds of restrictions. Not there's a lot of those states left, but there are a few, and maybe we'll talk about one of them in particular later. But and then also, if the Supreme Court takes up the Maryland case, against Maryland's assault weapons ban and they strike down the sales ban, this is probably what all those states that have assault weapons bans would go to next, is my guess. So pretty significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're spot on there that this becomes sort of the blueprint for hardware restrictions, Bruin-proofing hardware restrictions going forward if the Supreme Court ever decides to,
if they ever act on
big if there.
assault weapons ban.
But of course, we'll stay on top of all that because that'll be a big development in the Second
Amendment. Of
course,
if the Supreme Court takes up an assault weapons ban and upholds a ban on sales,
right,
this probably turns into one of those eventually, would be my guess too.
I think that's right because like you mentioned earlier, a big part of this becoming a permit to purchase scheme was Jared Polis's skepticism of an outright sales ban, and he is term limited next year. So a future governor might not have the same hangups about a flat out sales ban, and if a Supreme Court gives a rubber stamp for that, and you could see Colorado saying we have to get rid of the permit to purchase loophole, and then. Polis's involvement is also an interesting aspect of this because he is one of the leading potential presidential candidates for Democrats in 2028. And it's another sign that the party is not really moderating on guns. We talked about this when David Hogg was elected to be one of the co-chairs of the DNC. After the 2024 election, the Democrats had at least briefly moderated on some things like immigration, but I think all the signs that we've seen to this point suggest they're not changing course on guns. And so Polis being like, I think he's even kind of looked at as a more moderate-ish Democrat candidate, potential candidate. So him agreeing to do this sweeping new restrictions on most modern firearms in Colorado is perhaps another sign of where the Democratic Party is right now on this issue. Yeah, certainly. Moving on past my home state, the other big news was a series of announcements and some sort of head-scratching announcements out of the ATF this week. Yeah, you covered both of them, one on sort of the policy front and the other on personnel front.
Yeah, so we talked about last week, you had a piece, a member's piece that was asking the question of like, what happened with this Second Amendment review that the President Trump had ordered the DOJ to undertake, back in early February, right? And it had already been nearly 2 months when the review was supposed to be done in a month. And we hadn't had any significant news on any of the areas that the review was covering. And then, of course, after we published that piece, no idea if this had any impact or not, but they announced some movement on that front, or at least partially. They haven't released, obviously, the full report or anything yet, but they did announce the immediate revocation of the zero tolerance policy towards gun dealers at the ATF, which is a big concern for the industry, for the National Shooting Sports Foundation. By the way, Larry Keane is going to be on the interview podcast this week discussing this and also tariffs, which we're going to get to in a little bit here. But, they'd even publicly been sort of criticizing or at least calling on the administration to, undo this policy. It was one of those things that Trump, you can just undo. It was just a policy handed down by the Biden administration. It wasn't a rule. There's a lot more that goes into federal rulemaking. There's a whole, legal process you have to follow for that, and it takes a lot of time. But a policy like this is something that can be changed, pretty immediately. And they hadn't done it for whatever reason, but now they have. There was obviously some question as to how much this was still being enforced, right? There was a lawsuit last year where the ATF, there's a memo from the ATF that claimed they were walking back this policy, at least to some degree, that they now violations would have to be, violations by FFLs, federal firearms licensees, would have to be willful in order to, rise to the point of revocation of their license. Whereas before, one of the main complaints with this policy was that minor paperwork error was going, even unintentional minor errors were getting people's licenses pulled, basically ending, shutting down their business. But so now, there's been some action on that. And then the other thing they announced as part of that was that they're going to undertake further review of the pistol brace ban rule and the engaged in the business rule. So that's not necessarily immediate action. This is the result of the review is kind of another more specific review of these two rules. That again, these are things that have gone through the rulemaking process. There is a whole set of steps that you have to go through to undo a federal rule once it's in place, or to modify it or rescind it. So I guess they're going to be going through honestly, it sounds like they're going to take a couple months to figure out what they want to do on those two rules. The implication being that they're going to change them or rescind them. And then I guess they're going to go through the actual rulemaking process. That's what I got from the press release. I'm not entirely sure, because what they describe in the press release is like, we're going to work with stakeholders, including gun rights groups, they specifically say, over the next several months to figure out the best policy. But that's kind of what the rulemaking process is. Right. So that's what is a little bit confusing me, because the rulemaking process is you write up a rule, you put it out there for people to comment on, and then you're supposed to look at the comments, at least, that you get in that process, and then make changes to the rule that respond to these comments from stakeholders and the public. And then you put in your final rule. It's a bit odd to have them describe doing that and then going, they're kind of double dipping on that process. So I don't know if it's a little unclear to me. It sounds like they're going to review it and then they're going to do rulemaking, which rulemaking itself is kind of the same thing. I don't know. I don't know if you had a different read on it or not, but that was where a little bit of my confusion came from.
Yeah, that was sort of my takeaways. Is it's the first time that they formally named certain rules that they're going to be taking a look at. So that was something. But like you said, it wasn't like, hey, here's our actual write up of the new rule rescinding these old rules, and now we'll start the Administrative Procedures Act process. Yeah,
and then this has kind of been the question all along. Like the initial executive order review, like it identifies all these areas that gun rights advocates want them to take action in. So they no. But they don't actually take the action. They rely on a review process. It's similar. I don't know. It's just kind of the same concern.
Right. And the other big takeaway for me is that the frames and receiver rule was notably absent from this in terms of being named.
It was.
I don't know what to make of that just yet. I don't know if they're, because of the Supreme Court ruling, if maybe they're just giving up on that rule and just going to let it stand, or maybe at a future date they'll decide to review that. But I think that's noteworthy as well. It is, because that was the other major rule that Biden implemented, and it was nowhere to be found in this. But again, they did announce these are progress. This is something. I don't want to say it's nothing. It's something. And so they did that. Announced that on Monday, and then they made another kind of even more surprising announcement later on in the week, right? Yeah, that's right. This on the personnel front, we sort of out of left field learned that Kash Patel, who was originally tapped as the dual director of the FBI and acting director of the ATF, evidently is no longer the acting director of the ATF. And then it turns out maybe was possibly not the acting director of the ATF for quite a while. And maybe. Yeah, and we can't really, I know you tried to get some clarity on this, and no one seems to know exactly when he was the acting director and when he stopped being the acting director. We know that he's not anymore, but that's about it. Yeah. And by the way, it sounds like you've got your construction. Yeah, sorry, everyone. Started. Buzzsaw above me. This week is going to be a little bit of a noisy week for the podcast, because on the interview podcast, Larry's dog decided to join in for part of that. So forgive us. We are doing our best here. But so they've announced that Patel is no longer the acting director, and also that
Daniel Driscoll is going to be taking his place as acting director. Now, Daniel Driscoll is the Secretary of the Army. He's Senate confirmed. And that's probably why he was picked, because you can take somebody who's already been Senate confirmed and make them the acting director of an agency without having to go through the confirmation process again. So, that partially explains why they're using guys like Patel and Driscoll in this role. It's a little unclear. I mean, why those guys, why do it this way? I don't know. But yeah, so then when this happened, there was a report from NBC News. Ken, I shouldn't have tried to say his name because I never get it right. Delanian?
I think Delanian, yeah.
Yeah. So he reported that his sources claim that Patel was only acting director for a very short period of time, for like a day, perhaps. Now we know Patel went to the ATF and had a swearing-in ceremony. Now, since that swearing-in ceremony, basically every report and my sources as well say he really didn't have much to do with day-to-day operations at ATF. He may not have even been back to the building since that swearing-in. It's unclear. Maybe he was more involved at the top level, but we don't even know how long he was director, because for some reason, I asked the ATF directly. They couldn't say. They told me that was, a White House timeline. The White House is in charge of who's director at the ATF, but it's a little odd that the ATF can't say who was their director when, right? That's bizarre. And they directed me to DOJ, and then DOJ did the same thing. Said we can't. That's the White House thing, and then the White House contact, who did put out a statement at one point, which basically just said that Kash Patel was acting director briefly, but it didn't say when. And then that spokesperson at the White House just didn't respond to questions. So and they haven't presented a timeline to anybody else. How much this matters, I guess, is up to you, listener. I don't think that there's any real policy difference likely between Patel and Driscoll. They're both Trump appointees. I guess Patel, I think the gun rights groups, especially GOA, right? Gunners of America, looked at him as a sort of somebody on their side, somebody who was more vocally pro-gun. He had spoken at a GOA conference, although that was kind of as far as I could tell, that was sort of the gist of his credentials as a pro-gun guy. But, regardless, he had a lot of support in the gun rights community, and they kind of looked at him as their guy, or especially GOA. And so Driscoll doesn't have that kind of background necessarily, but I don't know that he has, that'll mean anything on a policy front, right? So how much difference it makes whether Driscoll's the acting head or Patel is in practice, not really clear to me. I will say that they were putting out press releases that had quotes from Kash Patel identified as the acting director until at least Monday. He was quoted in the release that announced the end of the zero tolerance policy and the review of those two ATF rules. So, if he wasn't actually acting director in there, that would be embarrassing. I don't know that it means anything legally. It's not clear to me. And look, it does perhaps speak to this point that we've made a number of times of this stuff is not necessarily a high priority in the Trump administration. It doesn't mean that they are not going to do these things, as we saw this week with the ATF. They did eventually rescind the zero tolerance policy officially. So they did accomplish that, and they're going to review these rules. Now, it maybe they won't take action on them for another couple of months, but I would lean in the direction of thinking they probably will take action on doing them. Maybe not the ghost gun one, but the other two, and the pistol brace one is kind of the biggest one anyway, as far as practical impact goes. But it's not something that they're really focused on, and maybe even less so than it seemed at first, because doesn't seem like Kash Patel, from the sources I spoke to inside and outside of the ATF, that he was ever really doing much day to day there. Maybe he was involved at the higher up level of, broader decision making, but it's not really clear, and we don't even really know when he was actually acting director. And this is, internally among agents from the sources that I spoke to, that has their main complaint has just been a lack of communication and direction, which has led to lower morale among, your sort of rank and file ATF agents. So, I think it was summed up pretty well by my source, who said, I don't think there's any grand plan here. So that he himself said that he doesn't think the ATF is a high priority for the administration. So I don't know, man. I don't know exactly what to make of the whole acting director swap and this weird thing where they won't say who was acting director when. The ATF should be able to tell you who its freaking leader is.
Who's in charge. Yeah.
Like, it's bizarre. I don't know. So that happened.
Yeah. I guess we'll have to see how it plays out.
We'll keep on top of it. It's very strange. I've never seen something like that before.
Yeah, it certainly is an odd development for a major federal law enforcement agency. But like you said, we'll see how it goes as plays out going forward. The other story we want to talk about is you had another good piece doing some more follow up on the potential fallout of the Trump administration's new tariff push, which has since been sort of pared back, but also ramped up against China substantially. So the ground is still shifting, obviously, as we're discussing these things, but at least some firearm industry folks, ammunition producers, and the like have spoken with you and talked about what this might do for their product and for the end consumer, right?
Yeah, and as you know, a lot of gun companies are not eager to talk about this. We reached out to a bunch of them, and only a few were willing to say anything. Maybe just partially because it's pretty unclear what the heck's going on. I think Larry we get into this more on the interview podcast, certainly with Larry, to try and get sort of the industry bird's eye view of this whole situation. But he called it, he said, it's like whiplash watching this happen because Trump paused the tariffs because he didn't really pause them. He paused the highest rates on most countries, and then he also increased the rate on China at the same time. So you still have a 10% across the board tariff on everyone, on all imports, which is surely going to impact the gun industry as well, which, I think might be counterintuitive for some people because the gun industry is dominated by American manufacturers. We talked about this last week, but it's something like 55 to 60% of the guns made the last 23 years were American made. Which is still obviously means, 40 to 45% were imports. But if I'm doing the math right, people can fact check me on that one. We have the raw numbers in our stories. It's 171 million American made guns to 93 million imported guns from 2000 to 2023. And then you have, on top of that, another 26 billion rounds of ammunition between 2010 and 2020. So just to give you that, I should have done the math before we started this, but I think it's somewhere between 55 and 60% of the guns sold in the U.S. were American made. So you would think, maybe the industry benefits from some of these tariffs, and I would think that it probably will weather them better than some other industries where nearly everything is produced in foreign countries. But of course, there's several problems. One, obviously, the things that are imported, which are substantial. A lot of the most popular firearms are from foreign manufacturers. Now, of course, some of those, like in the auto industry, are actually made here. SIG and Glock, for instance, have American factories. But, the most obvious effect will be on the imports. But there will still be impacts on American makers. And we talk about that with Larry, but just to give you some quotes from some of the other people we spoke to for this piece, because we did get a few people talk to this. For instance, Lucky Gunner, which is one of the nation's leading online ammunition dealers, said that they certainly expect costs to increase for both businesses and consumers because of these tariffs. But, one of the common themes here is that nobody really knows exactly how much prices are going to go up, especially given, the change in tariff from kind of day to day. It seems like this pause is supposed to last for 90 days. So maybe there's a little bit of clarity there. Although, the president is somebody who can change his mind pretty quickly, right? And just in pausing the tariffs themselves, he changed his mind because initially there was no way that was going to happen, and then it did. And so maybe it comes back later before those 90 days, or maybe the 90 days show up and he extends them or cancels them or what have you. I don't think it's possible to predict exactly how that'll go. But bottom line here is the prices are going to go up according to Lucky Gunner. But here's the quote from Anthony Welsh, who's a spokesperson over there. He said, "The long-term impact of tariffs is very fuzzy. Our purchasing team has a good relationship with importers and foreign manufacturers. Many of them believe price increases are coming soon. However, it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly what the increases will be." You also had Sam Gabbert, who runs SG Ammo out of Oklahoma, which is another online ammo dealer. And, he actually gave a little bit more of a specific idea here on the paused rate, the 10% rate. He said, using an example of MagTech, he said, MagTech in Brazil will sit with the smallest tariff at 10%, but still substantial to drive 9mm prices up $20 or so per 1,000 rounds. So there's maybe a more exact gauge of the current levels of tariffs on most countries. But, if things go back to the rates that the president initially announced, Lucky Gunner gave an example of how that might impact one of the most popular ammo brands. They said, "We carry and sell a lot of PMC ammo that's made in South Korea. Under President Trump's plan, that country faces a 25% tariff. The ammo game isn't a high margin market, so we don't expect the manufacturer will be able to absorb all that tariff. If the company anticipates it's a short-term solution, maybe they can absorb a portion of it, but it's not reasonable to think they can take a 25% hit on their wholesale price. It seems inevitable we will be paying more for ammo. In order to stay around, retailers will have to increase prices. In turn, American shooters will likely pay more for rounds." And I think just kind of to sum this section up here, I'll give you one more quote from Babbitt. It's not everybody we talked to, but just to give you I think he kind of puts the nail on it here. Gabbert said, quote, "In my opinion, unless the tariffs are reversed or reduced to much lower levels, the most likely course for where we are at is that many of the import ammo brands are driven out of business in 6 months to a year, or are forced to charge unrealistic prices that very few consumers will pay, shrinking their volume to an unsubstantial point. At the same time, U.S. manufacturing most likely slowly raises prices 3 to 8% once each quarter of remaining 2025 and early 2026, pushing prices up to match import competitors on the most popular calibers like 9mm 45 auto and 5.56, 223, and more, where profit margins have been suffering due to price cuts over the past 2 years, while also dealing with continuous upward movements in manufacturing costs." So now that was the SG Auto comments came before the pause. So I would expect that it's not going to be as severe of an impact as what he's describing there, but that's sort of the worst case picture for how these might play out. But, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking at length with Larry Keene from the National Shooting Sports Foundation on the Interview podcast. So tune in for more from that.
Absolutely. But getting into some of our newsletter links from outside the reload, we had an interesting one from Courthouse News Service talking about what the Supreme Court, I guess, didn't do this week. And that's they decided not to take up the New York so-called Brew and Response Bill lawsuit, Antonyuk, if folks remember the name of that case, because it was one of the more prominent legal challenges to New York's new restrictions on concealed carry.
Yeah.
And the Supreme Court flat out rejected taking the case this time.
Yes. So I guess at least they made a decision in one of these Second Amendment cases. Probably not the decision any gun rights advocate was hoping for. Now, Antioch, from what I recall, the lower court did block the so-called vampire rule, which requires that anyone who's carrying a gun have permission from the owner of a publicly accessible private property, something like a store or restaurant, a thing like that, before they can carry inside. Is sort of they call it the default rule, and it's it's swapped what has always been the case pretty much everywhere else, where, if you can carry in a publicly accessible private property, unless they say you can't, they have posted sign or whatever. So, New York has not won completely at the lower levels in that case. However, it does leave much of the New York Brew and Response Bill in place for now, at least. I think this was wasn't this at an interlocutory stage, like not full merits? Yeah. So
it's a review of a preliminary injunction. The Second Circuit declined to issue a sweeping preliminary injunction. Like you said, they left the vampire rule block in place, but most of the rest of the law they allowed to go back into effect. And the Supreme Court decision keeps that status quo. Yeah.
So it seems to continue this trend where they don't want to take up so-called interlocutory cases, cases where it hasn't reached the final merits ruling yet. So I don't know. It is interesting though, because if we remember, this was the case that tried to go up the Supreme Court right away after the first loss from the gun rights advocates that they suffered. And the court basically said, we want the Second Circuit to move quickly on this, but we're not going to intervene yet, even though we'd like because initially they actually got most of the law blocked by the district court. And so it was Alito wrote I guess a concurrence or a statement on denying the first time, I think it's GOA in this case, right? Gunners of America sought cert at the Supreme Court. And he basically just said, I understand that the court doesn't think this is ripe enough to take yet, but also, and I think Thomas signed on, right, as to that as well. But, we kind of like how the lower court handled this, and we just want to make sure that the second court moves quickly. And if they don't, the plaintiff should come back up here. Well, I don't know. I guess maybe they consider the second court moving along in this case fast enough to keep them satisfied, but, or that was all just cope from the conservative justices, which is another possibility with it, because they mentioned this idea in a number of cases that the court has rejected, Second Amendment cases. They mentioned a lot of respecting the procedures of the lower courts and waiting until they have a complete case to review. And that seems to be their tendency with a lot of these GBRs as well, right? Like, hey, make sure you've thoroughly considered everything we've had to say on the Second Amendment before this comes back up here. I don't know. So it does fit with that, but there's also a possibility that maybe there isn't a majority on the court that would, side with GOA in this case. And that's why it's not going up. We don't know. We can't know, but it is interesting to see.
Absolutely. And then the other newsletter link we want to touch on comes just from the New York Times, talking about Bloomberg and Everytown specifically starting to ramp up their activity and their spending in state races. This is talking about them having a specific eye towards state attorneys general races, which is an interesting new tact for them. The piece mentions they've been involved in state AG races before, but they're making a $10 million investment, or at least Michael Bloomberg is making a $10 million investment specifically for that process. And related, it's not in this story, but Everytown also made a similar announcement that they're planning to invest $1 million in your home state of Virginia for the upcoming gubernatorial election.
Yes, and this is what I was alluding to earlier as one of the states that may adopt this Colorado style permit to purchase law, because if Democrats win control here in the governor's race, and frankly, I think that's very likely to happen because just based on the structural aspect of this election, Virginia has off-year elections, right? So we have an election this year for their governor. The governor also can only serve one 6-year term at a time. You can't serve consecutive terms. So our incumbent Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin, who still remains polling-wise fairly popular, I think he's still above water in terms of his popularity, but he can't run again. At least not in this election. So you're going to have two new faces, essentially. I mean, not new to Virginia politics, but new to the governor's race. So there's no incumbent advantage because of that. And then there's a tendency in these off-year elections for the out party to do better, similar to a midterm election, right? So Donald Trump is president, and so Democrats have a better shot of winning the election here in Virginia because of that. And we've seen that track over time in Virginia, not every single time, but it's pretty common for that to happen. And especially with a lot of these cuts to government workers who live in Northern Virginia, that probably adds some fuel to the fire in terms of Democratic turnout. And Democrats have also, to this point, seen an advantage more recently in low turnout elections, which, off-year state elections tend to be lower turnout, right, certainly than a presidential election would be. And so there's a number of reasons to think that Democrats cannot just hold on to their pretty slim majorities in the House. I'm not sure. I think the Senate is up this year. But anyway, so there's good reason to think they're likely to hold on to their majorities in the Virginia legislature and capture the governorship. And the last time that happened, they passed a number of gun control laws, but similar to Colorado, they didn't pass an assault weapons ban. It took Colorado many years to finally get over the hump to put their law in. And because there was at least some internal opposition to sales bans. Maybe that's why I feel like that Colorado law could end up here next year in Virginia, if things go this way. And now you also see from this news that it's going to be a race that a lot of money gets put into, not just by Bloomberg and Everytown, but by a lot of people are going to be spending big money in this Virginia gubernatorial election for sure. So, the outlook is fairly grim on that front. For gun rights advocates in Virginia, not impossible though. These are just trends. It doesn't always hold, and there's a long way until election day. It's this year, but it's not till November, and that many months from now is a long time in politics. So we'll obviously pay attention to what goes on there. But the Youngkin himself just vetoed a whole package of, I think it was something like 40 or 34, I think.
Yeah, almost 3 dozen.
Yeah, gun control bills that the Democrats in the legislature had passed. So now, there is a tendency to pass things that you may vote for something is not going to become law. And some politicians may not vote for the same thing if it actually will become law. That's definitely a known tendency as well. So we'll see what exactly Democrats do, but this is definitely a state, one of the few states really, that I think that Colorado bill has a good shot of being replicated in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Virginia, like you said, is going to be the state to watch, or at least one of a small handful of states to watch in terms of some potential for significant movement in gun.
Not a lot of states left in that purple zone. So,
right.
anytime one changes hands, that's where you want to look for changing gun policy.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think that's all we got for this week, right? Do you have any fun plans for the weekend?
Wedding stuff. We're doing some cake tasting over the weekend.
Oh,
so
that does sound fun, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're still a little further away from our cake tasting wedding planning section yet. I still have to figure out the catering and tents for the farm. We're getting married on the farm, so that hopefully save us some money, we'll see. But yeah, the wedding planning is stressful but fun, right? That's been my experience, at least.
Yeah. Agreed. Definitely.
All right. Well, that's all we've got for you guys this week. I'm going to hand it off to myself, by the way, to tell you a little bit about the Dispatch, but I've just become a Dispatch contributor. So you'll be seeing maybe a bit more of my writing over there in the coming weeks and months. So look for that. But I'll tell you a little bit more about the Dispatch in our little ad swap we've got going on here. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch, and so clearly, I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news and it's focused on it. And I think it's fantastic, but they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. It was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, two guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here. And, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.